So I'm very glad to welcome you again to this event on climate change and religion perceptions, politics and radical potentials. My name is Tobias Muller. I'm a junior research fellow at the Woolf Institute and college research associate at King's College in Cambridge. And I have the pleasure to facilitate the event today. So this is a webinar series, as you know, on the question of climate change and religion, and it is co-hosted by the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion and the Woolf Institute. And as some of you might know, actually these two institutes share the same building, and we often in the corridors bump into each other. And one of the thing that is on our minds and that is really important for both of us are kind of the big questions and the challenges that society is facing. And in terms of thinking about science, obviously one of the key topics of scientific research is climate change, but also that thing that challenges societies and also religious groups across the globe is climate change. And that's how we came together to organize this event together. So as a brief introduction on today's topic, Amitav Ghosh's path-breaking book, The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, argues that those responsible for the visions in our society, the future visionary, if you want, particularly artists and novelists, have failed to make us realize that we are in the midst of a global climate breakdown. He writes that rather than focusing on the monumental challenges of climate change, politics today is primarily focusing on questions of identity, and he mentions particularly religion, caste, ethnicity, language, and so on. And I suppose the recent Trump election versus Biden election campaign shows these cleavages coming up very vividly. So he asks, will at some point people think back to this time in the same way that we think back at, and some of you might remember that, where were you when the Berlin Wall came down? Or where were you when 9/11 happened? Will people ask, where were you when we reached 400 parts per million? Or where were you when the Larsen B ice shelf broke up? And he has in the last part of his book a really interesting comparison between the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015 and the Laudato Si encyclic letter of Pope Francis. And he shows in a really remarkable way how much more ambitious and path-breaking in a way the Pope's exhortations are compared to that rather dry Paris agreement. And it is very interesting to see in a time when there's a certain relief often that President-elect Joe Biden wants to rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, that still where we are at with the Paris Climate Agreement is something that Amitav Ghosh calls collective suicide. And in comparison to that, he, for instance, quotes from Laudato Si, and I quote, "A true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment, so far as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor." And I think this is an interesting element because it directly links the question of science, of earth sciences, of climate change to questions of society, of justice. And these, of course, are at the heart of many of the world's religious traditions, and of course also other traditions of ethics and thinking. But he goes even further, and he has this really remarkable passage that I would like to read out to you, and then we come to the speakers of today in The Great Derangement. So the question is, if states today have failed and international organizations have failed to adequately act on the climate crisis, who else can do it? So he says, and I quote, "If a significant breakthrough is to be achieved, if the securitization and corporatization of climate change is to be prevented, then already existing communities and mass organizations will have to be at the forefront of this struggle. And of such organizations, those with religious affiliations possesses the ability to mobilize people in far greater numbers than any others. Moreover, religious worldviews are not subject to the limitations that have made climate change such a challenge for our existing institutions of governance. They transcend nation states and they acknowledge intergenerational long-term responsibilities. They do not partake of economistic ways of thinking and are therefore capable of imagining non-linear change, catastrophe, in other words, in ways that are perhaps close to forms of reason deployed by contemporary nation states. Finally, it is impossible to see any way out of this crisis without an acceptance of limits and limitations. And this, in turn, I think, intimately is related to the idea of the sacred, however one may wish to conceive of it. And this brings us directly, I think, to the questions of our conference, not only about perception and science, but also to the responses to the various crises, and asking how the question of climate change is inextricably linked to the question of justice. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce our three speakers today. We have a leading scholar of religion, a policy director of a climate change think tank, and the senior rabbi of Masorti Judaism in the UK. So first of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Irene Becci, who's a professor at the University of Lausanne, chair of emergent religions and new spiritualities. She's a director of what probably translated would be the Institute for Social Science and Social Research on Religion. She's also the vice president of the International Society for the Sociology of Religion, and previously held academic positions at the Max Planck Institute in Halle, at the EUI in Florence. And she is one of the authors of this major volume of religion in post-socialist context, particularly in the city of Potsdam. I think it's one of the only studies where really every single religious organization of one city is actually being analyzed and discussed. Among her numerous books and publications, I just pick out two. One is the article Subtle Spirituality Among Environmentalists, a Swiss study, part of a broader special issue on the spiritualization of ecology, and a book chapter that is called Staging a Green Spirituality in the Parks of Lausanne and Geneva, a spatial approach to ecological urban public urban festivals. Our second speaker will be Dr. Najma Mohamed, who is the policy director at the Green Economy Coalition, which is the world's largest alliance of civil society organizations inspiring a transition to green and fair economies. She has experience in research, policy, and practice, and has worked as a technical advisor on the environment, development, and climate change for more than 20 years. Most recently, she has worked as a policy advisor to South Africa's Green Fund and to the International Labour Organization. She has also recently published an edited volume called Sustainability Transitions in South Africa, which assesses whether the country's transition pathway is actually green and just. In addition to degrees in environment and geographical science, she has a PhD from Stellenbosch University that focuses on Islamic environmental ethics and education. And I guess this is kind of a key part of what she's going to talk about today. Thirdly, it's my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg. Jonathan Wittenberg was born in Glasgow to a German Jewish refugee family. He was appointed rabbi of the North London Masorti Synagogue already in 1987, and a senior rabbi of the Assembly of Masorti Synagogues in the UK in 2008. He's also president of the Council of Christians and Jews and a member of the Council of Imams and Rabbis. He's also, and this is particularly interesting, I think, for us here, I'm a co-founder of Eco Synagogue and jtree.global, and I'm looking forward to learning more about what that is, and is deeply engaged in environmental issues. Among his publications are The Eternal Journey, Meditations on the Jewish New Year, and most recently, intriguingly, Things My Dog Has Taught Me About Being a Better Human. He also told me that he loves plants, animals, people, woodland and mountain walks, and I'm sure we can benefit from these more broader reflections on our topic as well. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Irene Becci. Irene, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. This sounds very interesting. I'm looking forward to listening to everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Right. And now I think you can even soon see, wait, up somewhere here. Yes. All right. So thank you very much for this invitation. Again, I had the occasion to say before that it's a pity not to be there physically and see everybody, but it's kind of still very, yeah, it makes me dizzy to speak in front of all these people. So I'm not alone though, because I will talk today about a research actually. I thought maybe the axis that where my reflections could be most interesting will, as Tobias said, I'm a sociologist and anthropologist, so I'm speaking out of a research perspective here, ethnographic research perspective. And I thought maybe there's something we can say. So we usually try not to be normative in what we do. We try to be rather analytic and descriptive, but of course we share this plan of environmentalist transition that we all have to favor clearly. So I think there's something we can say which is interesting about this idea about crisis and responses. What are the achievements and challenges of religious and non-religious grassroots activism vis-a-vis representative politics? Because in a way, as Tobias said about Potsdam, what I like to do in my research is not necessarily start from one religious group, one particular religious group, but starting from an area, starting from a place, a society, a given group, and see what happens there. And this is in a way what we try to do with a research that we called towards we asked actually with quotation marks and with a question mark whether we were actually going towards something that we could call a spiritualization of ecology, because we basically really looking around what happened in Switzerland, where there is an environmentalist movement, and there is of course some sensitivity about ecology, which is not very strong at all among religious actors. But for some years, we started to observe that actually there is a sort of an increasing deployment of religious or spiritual metaphors, sort of a rituality among environmentalists. And in a way, maybe this sounds quite banal for an Anglophone audience, but it's really not from a Swiss point of view, and in particular from a French Francophone Swiss point of view. I will say more about the specific location of this idea. And we were actually wondering whether what we saw, and I will talk about what it is, this sort of spiritualization of ecology, because as we all know, the ecological movements and the environmentalist movements has been since the beginning in a way carrying in itself some sort of religious aspects, a sort of idea about you cannot solve anything or understand the crisis and the pollution issues without seeing that everything is connected in a way, that there's a relationality between nature, humans, and that we need to think on a long-term perspective, probably a perspective also that religions can see more clearly. So this religious sort of nexus idea has been there, but has really been completely, almost completely made invisible, in particular with the politicization of ecology, environmental actions, in particular in the French, laïque, secularist, and the Francophone Switzerland too, part of the area. And we thought, well, we need to question what is happening. Why is sort of suddenly spirituality and the notion of spirituality becoming a resource, something that is legitimate and makes sense within this struggle for environmentalism? And we thought maybe there's an encounter or sort of simultaneous action between this sort of spiritual wave and what other authors have called the greening of religion, like Charles Taylor. So in a way, is there something culturally larger going on that is rather captured into the notion of spirituality, and something more institutional going on within religious institutions and organizations? And to come back to this question, if this has in a way, if it is an achievement and a challenge for representative politics, we could ask whether this does strengthen an impact on politics, because a priori there is no really direct link of religious organizations from this perspective of Europe on representative politics in terms of ecology. This is where we start actually. So this is the team as I said, I'm not alone. I'm talking, but I'm working on this with this research, which started on February 2017, but we did already preliminary work since 2015, and we are about to end, in particular with a senior researcher, Christophe Monod, and a doctoral student, Alexandre Grandjean, and 2 MA students who have followed the whole research, Salome Okwekpen and Virgile Delma. So I can just, I will now make the rather general point of view, but just to say that Christophe Monod was rather in charge of what I call maybe this greening of religion, that he looked more at institutional religions, and Alexandre Grandjean looked at different places of spiritualization of ecology, in particular among biodynamic viticultures, wine crafting. So we actually really saw that within public space, so we're not going into private areas, we go reading what is happening in the public debates. There is an increasing presence of religious or spiritual key actors. Just to mention, as you said already, this book Laudato Si from Pope Francis has had really a big impact, probably a bigger impact in the public area than within Catholic nations necessarily. There are more and more practices that are visible during events that are ecological events, environmentalist events, like meditation or shamanic visualization practices. These sort of notions are very present more and more. Interiority, yoga, all sorts of energy practices. There's a very strong revalorization also of autochthonous groups and of the idea that there's some wisdom in these groups, called in particular very often spiritual more than religious. And this gives this idea of this organicistic, holistic, vitalist worldview. Well, this has been clear in some books, in cultural productions, I would say. There have been quite a lot of films, movies that really had a big impact. There's a green festival, movie festival around in Switzerland, which has strongly expressed this, favored this sort of movie that stress the interior dimension of ecology, the spiritual dimension of ecology. There are more and more issues like initiatives around urban gardening, permaculture, that are associated with spirituality. Just to make an example, one of the workshops we followed in Lausanne was on permaculture, for instance, but it was actually given by Star Hawk, who is this activist from California, who is also the main representative of what is called the New Witches or the Wicca movement or whatever. So we looked at, on the one hand, at churches. We actually tried to look also at interreligious experiences or other non-Christian groups. We did really find many that had the means and had the capacity to develop strong ecological, environmentalist initiatives. So finally, what we did is to really accentuate, go into more details in different churches, parishes, and there are some initiatives. There are these green parishes that try to make a whole program how the churches can influence their members, but also concretely, pragmatically become greener. And we looked at other sort of places, because from its beginning, and Manuel Castells shows this very clearly, the environmentalist movements has worked around events and around media importance, impact on media. And we looked so at different events, festivals and manifestation, demonstrations, and everything that was sort of very easily accessible for a public audience. And we actually really looked at more than 40 events, conferences, roundtables, whatever. We had a lot of interviews with major representative speakers, people who were actually really at the forefront of these sort of discourses. And as I said, there is a specificity in this Swiss Francophone context, because on the one hand, it's close to France, but it's not Catholic, and it's not laïc neither. So there's a sort of big influence of French philosophy, which has hesitated very much to talk about environmentalism or ecologism in spiritual terms, because of the secularist influence. we had a lot of Marxist thinkers, even those thinkers from France that actually were committed to some Christian religions, have kind of not been heard as spiritual discourses, but they actually were really heard as philosophical or Marxist speakers. So there has been this influence of ecosophy, for instance, but never was this shown in terms of spirituality as you could have in Anglophone context in Europe around other RNS, for instance, or other speakers or writers of deep ecology. So it's very interesting to see how this sort of a shared semantics, we call it, around the emphasis put on interiority, spirituality is emerging. There have been more and more like mottos about be the change you wish to see in the world. Some important works of Starhawk, of Joanna Macy, translated into French. And these events and these places and these initiatives created conditions, and this is about something that happened for the last 20 years more or less. It wasn't like this before, but around the turning of the millennium, where elective affinities kind of emerged around people meeting at these places. And what emerged there is this dimension, which is present from the beginning, but now really came out to be at the same time global and local within this ecological discourse, where spirituality, and we have been making also some questionnaires and some analysis of quantitative data. When people in this context say spirituality, they really, in most cases, don't mean belonging to any religious organization, but they mean really actually a certain sort of pragmatic resource for their militancy, for their activism. It can be through an institution or a network, but really network is the key word here. We actually thought about rhizomic even, people working together, and I will show you some network possibilities. We have called this, as Tobias also said, a subtle green spirituality in the sense that it's subtle because it can be used pragmatically, this sort of spirituality. And it's about changing, a big change, a great turn, a change of paradigm in people's life with a whole strong, holistic and integral perspective. How did this emerge? And we think maybe, well, this is just some pictures. You don't need to read, it's remained in Italian, about these events we have been observing. We can also show that this sort of turn, as I said, in particular from the beginning of the millennium, has been also not only in culture product, but also in consumption. And this is Alexandre Grandjean's work in his doctoral PhD work. He has been showing how there is a turn and there is an increasing interest in biodynamic wine, for instance, of producers and of consumptions. And it's a whole aspect where this idea that actually what you drink, what you do with your body is more than just alimentation. It's more, it's really connecting yourself to the whole issue of ecology. So we have been mapping, actually, this is really just to show you aesthetically, you don't need to go into the details, mapping if really what we had the impression was emerging there could happen because people were meeting. And actually we found that people were meeting. A lot of festivals integrated some church actors. Other events did also some interreligious roundtables, let people talk from different perspectives. So there has been a really, for years, a progress and a process in looking for this shared and this common semantics around spirituality and ecology. And what we can also see is that there's a lot of bottom-up grassroots activism going on, where somehow spirituality or religion is involved and it's present, but there is very few top-down initiatives going on. There's very few political parties coming back to these actors, or very few really religious organizations having a bigger impact on ecology. And basically what we also saw, I just need to conclude at some point, is that of course the spirituality I'm talking about is has a big variety of forms of spirituality. You can have from eco-spirituality, permaculture, really Christian meditation, whatever, to neo-animism, neo-pagan, neo-shamanism, new age. But if you look at a little bit closer at the people practicing this sort of eco-spirituality, you can see that there's a big difference in terms of the degree to which they are established. So not all these actors do have the same means, do have the same resources. Some are much more integrated into the structural set, of the society, the organizations. They are paid for what they are doing, and others are really just volunteering or are just acting on a totally another basis. And also in terms of their impact is very smaller than bigger actors. So we can say that we are actually observing a sort of the creation of a sort of canopy, which is eco-spiritual, where this notion of spirituality comes up again and again. But there's also, of course, limits and boundaries. They do exist where people cannot necessarily meet, because they really have different ideas of what this spirituality is and how you need to practice it. But actually, what is interesting to see is that within the environmentalist movements, this sort of cacophony, as Manuel Castells wrote, is very common, and it has always existed. So I think this movement or this emergence of spirituality is not looking or aiming at finding necessarily a totally dogmatic, clearly shared basis, but a very pragmatic one, which could be inspired by some interreligious activities, for instance. So this was sort of a short idea from my point of view. You can find more if you have a look at the publications we have, and then we'll be happy to answer your questions, of course, too.
Thank you so much, Irene, for this really kind of, opening up also our perspective to the different types of religious actors. I think that's for people maybe outside of the field of the study of religion is really interesting. Often when people think about religion, then they often have kind of, Christianity or Islam and Judaism, and then maybe Hinduism. So there's kind of a certain limitation to that. But would you show, interestingly, that in the field of ecology, there seemed to be much more going on? And again, kind of using this term of spirituality, of course, that a lot of people are discussing how that might help us to understand these things and how that is actually interwoven with other not necessarily religious movements in the first place. So I think that's a really interesting perspective as well, to really broaden our understanding of religion and of religious organizations as well. So thank you for making us aware of these, and also giving us a lot of really interesting terms like the biodynamic and the pragmatic, subtle resources as well to think with. Thank you very much. So now I'm looking forward to Najma's presentation. Najma, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Tobias, and thank you for the introduction. I'll also be sharing my screen, and I'd really like to share with you stories from another part of the world, very far from Switzerland. If you haven't picked it up from the accent yet, I'm from South Africa. So the stories that I want to share with you really come from where I grew up, and how I started interacting with what I call the liberation eco-theology of Islam. So I'll start sharing my screen, and I hope that we can then start all together. Just give that another go. I think, is that good? Yeah. All good? Thanks. So good evening and good day, wherever everyone's joining from. I'm joining you from London here, so also very far from home for me. So I wanted to start a bit with a reflection on the context that we're facing, and to spend the least time on this, because this is what I work on all week, all year, for the last 2 decades of my environmental career. And I want to share with you another part of my career. But I think, just to echo how Tobias introduced the topic, that we know that our knowledge and understanding of the crisis has been growing. We know that the 1960s, 1970s especially was a very fertile time where our understanding grew of the ecological crisis that we were facing. And then 80s, 90s were really the decades where we had to hit the sobering reality that our 200 years of industrialization and the pathway that we took had led to the issue that we all know so well today as climate change. But I think, Tobias, you also alluded to the fact that lots of commentators are mentioning that there's a lot of inaction And even though we know the scale of the challenge and we're beginning to see the impact, we haven't yet reached the scale of action that's really commensurate with the type of challenges that we're facing. And yes, for me, most of my work actually rests on trying to work on getting the political will, the policy, the technological solutions, the finance to actually flow in the kind of directions that we needed to, so we can make a systemic shift in the pathway that we're on. But I think there's an increasing recognition that these crises that we're facing really are rooted in the human-environment relationship, and that we need to do a lot more to understand how we view, value, and interact with nature, and how we respond authentically to these challenges of our time. So I've responded, I think, very creatively to the 3 questions that the organizers sent my way. So I've actually thought they were incredibly interesting directions to go into. So I do want to speak to the ethics and imaginaries, to crisis and response, and as well as to transitions. So this is a picture actually that I saw when I went to the Tate Modern here in London. And it is actually a picture of my hometown, and it's entitled On the Beach. And it's a picture by David Goldblatt, who's a world-renowned photographer from South Africa, that captured, if you can read the details, a lot of what life was like in apartheid South Africa. But this is the picture that greeted me 5 to 7 minutes walk from my home. And this is a picture I grew up seeing and had to make sense of as someone growing up in South Africa. But let me start with a good part of the story that I want to tell you, is that I think, like many people that end up working in the environmental sector, I grew up with a very deep love and awareness of the natural world. I was always trying to find any excuse to be outside, any excuse to help my grandmother in the garden, and trying to figure out how this amazing world was working. And I was not in kindergarten or in preschool, whatever term you use, because that time there wasn't preschool, and we had a loving grandmother at home that was helping my mother raise us and look after us. But I lived one road away from the mosque, and I have a very vivid memory of attending one Friday prayer and coming back on my own, you know, skipping and jumping and just looking at the world with completely new eyes, because I had heard the Friday sermon was focused, you know, on the natural world, and that everything in nature was, you know, worshipping the Creator. It was alive, it was communities like us, and, you know, it had an intrinsic value. And I think, well, that love, that connection, that awe that I had for nature, it all made so much sense to me, hearing that message as a young child. And then I confront this picture. And how did I make sense, you know, of growing up in South Africa at a time where you could see, you know, the ecological crisis that we were in, and this crisis of social injustice. And I remember, so a little bit about my home. I grew up in a family as well who was very politically active. So student activists, exiles on the move out of South Africa, trade union meetings. It was my home life on a, you know, a regular basis. And when I expressed to my family, I really want to go and study environmental sciences, everyone looked at me with a blank face and said, you know, just take a walk 7 minutes to the beach, and you want to be working on the environmental crisis. And so my eldest brother used to tease me, and for a while he just didn't call me Najma, he called me Save the Whales. I told him, you know, actually really I'm interested in saving the whales and the people. And I eventually did go in the environmental sector. It was a very interesting and challenging time in post-apartheid South Africa. I was 20 years old when I voted for the first time in 1994. It was such an experience. I was actually on an environmental field trip in my 3rd year geography class, and I voted not in my city, but out in the rural area. And yeah, I carried on. I mean, it was definitely coming into the sector with not a lot of voices, not a lot of narratives that spoke to that intersection of social and ecological justice. But I was very fortunate in my career to come across the field of political ecology and really find the narrative that resonates with me. And then, of course, my interest in finding out about Islam was growing more and more. And I remember sitting opposite one of my supervisors at university and contemplating the idea of a PhD. And I was telling her, I really would love to do it on the ecological narrative of Islam. And she says, well, you've got such an interesting trajectory in your career. How does this build on that? I thought it absolutely builds on it, because it's a narrative that links, you know, knowledge and understanding to action. And that's, you know, what a lot of my career has been about, in the environmental sector. And so many years after I saw this picture and had to make sense of growing up in South Africa and so much of the other injustices that continue to exist in the world, I really developed and grew into, this narrative of Islam, that it presents, an ethic and an imaginary, I think, that adds to, the diversity of perspectives that we need to make sense of the crisis. And I just love this term that Vandana Shiva uses, that, we need to go beyond, monocultures of the mind, and thinking that there's only one way of understanding the questions that we are faced with. And so really for me to share with you that to me, these eco-justice ethics of Islam, and there is a spectrum of them, present to me really an imaginary based on the sovereignty of the Creator, of ultimate ownership of that does not rest with humankind, that there's responsible trusteeship of humankind and attendant ethical and guidelines of how to exert and how to carry, rather, that trusteeship, and the intrinsic value of creation. And for me, that call to action that I experienced in apartheid South Africa, that for me, it was not enough to recognize that injustice, but to understand that I had a duty to act upon that, was very much the message that I carried into my environmental career. And some of the other things that really stand out to me, and that's why I feel it's best described as a liberatory eco-justice ethic. It is a synthesis between text, traditions, and understandings. And I was also fortunate to benefit from the numerous perspectives that came out in the 1990s and the 2000s by lots of thinkers on the environmental message of Islam. But it's also an eco-theology that commits to link the social and environmental justice and links belief and action. And so I want to link to my second story that I want to tell you, just to link, the belief and action, and that's around the issue of water. And again, the story that I want to take from where I come from. And so in 2017 and 2018, South Africa faced quite a devastating drought, and the province of the Western Cape was the worst affected. You might have seen it in the news. It was very famous because it was the first time really that the city, the scale of Cape Town, was actually facing what they call the day zero. So they had a countdown into the city on the day when the city would actually run out of water. And this had been a crisis in the making. And climate change predictions for South Africa is quite dire. And I think the country realizes that water, South Africa is a semi-arid country and has always faced challenges with water. But this reached critical levels. And I remember going back to my family at the beginning of 2018, and I was just completely astounded to the practices that family members were carrying on in their homes. The water you washed the vegetables with had to be stored for the plants. Water for ablution purposes before the prayer was restricted to a certain amount. Really practical, tangible actions. And the pictures that I want to share with you is to show you how absolutely vital the role of faith communities across the board was to help get action going. And it was, such an incredible moment. And let me share with you some of the highlights. These restrictions affected everybody, farmers, businesses. There were some businesses who had to close in this time because the restrictions carried on for almost a year. Citizens and faith groups really got their act together and became part of the action. And I think they not only drew on principles and practices that particular faith community was engaged in, and any of you, if you know the intricacies of the religion of Islam, you understand how integral water is to a lot of the life of a Muslim in preparing for prayer, in understanding, and we have very, very strong teachings on how we have to be very careful and conscious of how we use water. But it was not only beliefs and practices, but educational institutions, as you might have seen from the pictures that I shared with you, that sprung into action. Young children who were taught the message not only on how to take the ablution, but took this message, back home about caring for water. The deep reach that faith communities have into communities and citizens, that was really important. And the finance. Faith communities have access to a lot of money, and you could see that this was a time where there was a lot of disaster support coming from the government, but faith communities really challenged a lot of the charitable monies that they had into supporting vulnerable communities. I think for me, what was very heartening, and as much as I love my country, and I think you got that from my stories, we are still amongst the most unequal countries in the world. And you could see this during the crisis, that people were not affected the same way. Yes, all of us had similar restrictions, but certainly people living in informal settlements had a much harder time. And so I love this quote from one of the religious scholars based at South Africa's Muslim Judicial Council. He actually said, the root cause is the way we live. You have a hand in it and you can correct it. And I think many of the faith communities took this issue at a bigger level, that we actually have to start questioning the direction of our economies and our societies. What are we investing in? How are we producing? How are we consuming? Because this crisis was as much one as it was of what climate change could bring to this part of the world. It was also one of poor management of infrastructure, unequal distribution of water resources, but also the very much the issue that we face is at a global level. Some people consuming at a level that borders on wastefulness, and others not having to consume even for their daily needs. And this was an incredible moment for the faith community to come together. And you saw these really strong alliances around social and environmental justice emerging. And that's really, you know, my last story. And Tobias, I hope I'm still on time. And if you don't know the story, and I leave you with one amazing story this evening, let it be this one. If you follow the global prizes, the global environmental prizes, you might recognize the two ladies that are on this picture. Liz McDade, who is working for the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Initiative, and Makoma Lekalakala, who's actually the head of EarthLife Africa. And if you just have a look at the pictures, it tells a story. This was a sustained campaign and activity to stop what was regarded by many South Africans as an illegal nuclear deal in the country from going ahead. We are one of the few countries, if I think not, we might not be the only one on the African continent that actually already has nuclear energy in our energy mix. And this comes to the whole story of transitions. South Africa is amongst the more than 80 countries globally that have committed to actually transition to a fairer and a greener economy. But our challenge is particularly difficult because 80% of our energy comes from coal-based power. We are a country blessed with coal resources. And so shifting and managing the jobs and managing the livelihoods and the infrastructure that is developed around the coal sector towards renewable energy is not going to be an easy task. And we know that. And we know that as a country, we are committed to make sure that this is a just transition and that workers and families and communities that rely on the sector are taken along. But the good side is that we are also blessed with some of the best solar resources in the world. If you visited South Africa, it's a land of a lot of sunshine. And we've got some of the biggest concentrated solar power plants in the world that are starting to come up. But South Africans generally didn't want this nuclear deal for two reasons. First of all, there were major questions around the procurement of the deal, major irregularities around the governance and the transparency of the deal making. And there was a social and ecological question around the health impacts, the environmental impacts of nuclear energy. And so this incredible alliance emerged. And this is such a story to tell, because these two organizations took the South African government to court, stopped the nuclear deal and won the case, and were awarded the payment of their legal fees by the South African Ministry of Energy, who had to pay for the entire court case. The story hasn't ended, and unfortunately, my own personal view is that there was some deal struck somewhere in the last decade to get nuclear energy into South Africa. There are again talks of nuclear energy, and the organizations are stepping up to fight it again. But it was a major, major win to show, you know, the alliance that can emerge when I think faith traditions own and harness, you know, the liberatory dynamic of the faith. And the lesson is really in getting that alliance together. And just to share with you again a statement from one of the religious leaders at the Muslim Judicial Council, who said, use a very strong juristic principle from the Islamic faith tradition, and you said as Muslims, the juristic ruling of removal of harm and the procurement of benefit clarifies our position on nuclear energy with a clear stop the nukes. And so you saw an immense, energy actually emerging around this issue, and it's a continuing fight. And it really showed that solidarity that's needed for a just and an inclusive and a transparent transition to the new economy that we really need across the world. So my final slide, Tobias. I think my final reflection really on this liberatory ethic is that for me, living in justice with people and with the planet, it's an obligation for every Muslim woman, man, and child who actually accepts that mandate of living as the vice-student representative of God on earth. And this eco-justice ethic is not only about the knowledge and understanding, but putting that into practice. And I think Muslims at over 1 billion of the world's population has a responsibility to put that ethic, into practice in the way we live, consume, the way we vote, the way we invest, and to find, a path of displaying, that transformative force of the faith tradition, which really propels us towards living in justice with all of creation. And I share, I think, which is for me one of my favorite verses from the Quran, which is the importance placed on being amongst those who are just to people and to all of creation. And thank you so much for listening and for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Najma, for a really, really powerful, canvas of different types of activities and from a global South perspective, but maybe actually showing us the frontiers in kind of the way of a theory and politics from the South, where a lot of the rest of the world will head as well. So probably if we want to learn the lessons of where we're heading to, probably Cape Town, South Africa is a very good place to look and to learn from kind of what probably can be called the frontline struggles already that you've been going through. And also I think this connection that you made in the beginning with the slide, I don't know whether everybody could see what was written there, might be a bit small for some, kind of that there was some beaches reserved for white people and for so-called other races. So this kind of connection between exclusion also based on race and how these kind of become aggravated and exclusions based on class and gender through environmental destruction, and that connection that this example very powerfully shares, I think. So thank you so much for making us aware of that. It is now my pleasure to give the floor over to the last speaker, Rabbi Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you for your welcome, and thank you also for previous speakers. And Najma, your passion and the way you express it, it so articulates my own feeling rooted in my Judaism. And one of the things about environment, as you, Professor Irene, said, is it brings us together in all kinds of connection that I might not have thought or predicted. I remember years ago I had to speak on the subject of St. Ethelburga's, a church of reconciliation which was bombed by the IRA in London, and I was followed by a passionate secularist, and we both used the word sacred. What emerged was actually the sense of the sacred in, I would have called it creation, you would have called it in nature, was so similar that, we found ourselves in such unexpected ways speaking the same language. And that's really, really important, because we can create companionship and solidarity across our faiths and a range of spiritualities that that together are powerful. I'm a little bit of an outsider here, as I'm not a researcher. I'm not sort of professionally engaged in the environment, but I'm passionately engaged in it, and it's become by far the most important aspect of being a community and a religious leader to me. And it's motivated, just for a personal word, by two different emotions. One is love. I think, like you, Najma, I've grown up with a great love of the natural world, a strong desire never to harm, a horror at the way our civilization treats nature, sentient beings and animals, and a great love of them. And the other side is fear, the fear of what the world could be like for our children. And even in the southeast of England, which has now become at risk of drought area, everybody thinks it rains all the time in England, but actually rain has become an issue. And the yellowing hot summers are a small sign of what really terrifies me. And that motivates me with a kind of passion I feel, which brings together my religious roots, my sense of what it is to be a human being in an interconnected world. Part of what I understood this to be about when we talk about imaginaries is, part of the role of religion is finding a compelling narrative that will take others with us on a journey to profound change, which includes affecting our behaviors in terms not just of saying yes to things, but saying no to things. It includes a level of self-discipline and a level of change, which is difficult. And finding that narrative through personal stories, songs, poems, and texts is something really important, because it has to be embedded in our sense of our culture and our civilization. So I want to start with that and then move towards actions that I'm struggling with. So I'm also going to screen share. I'm going to do it briefly and look at a couple of slides. Here is, hoping people can see it, one of the oldest stories we know, but it's actually very relevant. This is Noah's Ark, of course. The animals went in 2 by 2, and we tend to teach it as a children's song. There's the 2 pandas very sweetly looking out, but we don't think about all who did not get into the ark. It's actually a narrative of ecological collapse and social disaster, and the rescue of the pool of biodiversity. Perhaps it's better off than we may be in the future. But here are 2 kind of accounts, one biblical and one rabbinic, sort of based on later text, which show the failure to come to create a narrative adequate to carry other people with it. And I think they have some challenging things to say to us as we try to move our civilization and our culture into a different narrative. So here is Aviva Zorenberg, is a Bible commentator, and here is her comment about Noah. Noah in the Bible does exactly what God says. In that sense, he comes across as a good person. We're told he's righteous. But in terms of protesting, how can the world be destroyed? How can we continue to live in this way? He says not a single word. If you look at the story in the Hebrew Bible, Noah is totally silent. He does not speak one word till after the flood. If we're any doubt about who Noah is, we only have to look at the central fact of his silence. And there's a clear warning. We are not entitled to be silent now. And Andre Neher, his unqualified apathy, is not mitigated by the Midrashic scenario. We're going to look at that, because what Noah says is, so that I and my household may escape. As it were, Noah hasn't shed the sense of kind of egocentric or culture-centric, me and my immediate family, we need to survive, way of looking at the world into a far more inclusive and holistic way of looking at the world. I actually question the phrase there, unqualified apathy. It may have been hopelessness, which isn't quite the same as apathy. And then Noah's silence, I suggest, is a metastasis of the sickness of his time. And I wonder whether the failure to act adequately in spite of so much warning may be called a metastasis of the sickness of our time. And what would that sickness be? In a way, it's huge. It's the trajectory of Western or Northern and Western civilization into the sense that we are entitled to consume. And that's indicated, I think, by the measure of our societies is described by the word growth. Now, clearly this is complicated because the lack of growth affects the poor more. There's huge issues of justice there. But I find that when I wrote that out this afternoon, preparing for this, a metastasis of the sickness of our time, I find it disturbing. In the Midrashic world, Noah does talk. This is rabbinic, as it were, fantasy around the text. They fill in the gaps, they fill in the silence with what might have happened. And here they are now describing the generation of the flood and Noah's response and their response back. They waxed haughty only because of the good God lavished on them. And they spent their days in prosperity and their years in pleasure. this is far from an adequate account of the injustices and suffering of contemporary civilization, but it may be an account of the objectives of those who lead that civilization politically and what we all aspire to. It may not be wrong to aspire to it, but I think we have to rethink our objectives as communities, as countries, and as civilization. Can it be contentment? Can it be wisdom? Can it be collectivity? Can it be interconnectivity with nature? Because if we don't do that, we're not going to change direction. And then very, very interestingly, this Midrash, now we're looking at the text, 1700 years old, that they mock Noah when he does warn. A flood of fire, we've got a substance which will put it out. If it's water, if it comes from the earth, we'll cover the earth with iron plates. If from heaven, we'll ward it off, as if to say, technology is adequate to all of this. We don't have to worry. Science will find the answers. That's what it seems to me, that's what's being talked about there. I'll just end my screen share just for a little bit. I may want to go back to it later. So here are warnings about narratives that haven't worked, and put the challenge, how do we create a narrative that has worked? Now, right at the beginning, Tobias, you mentioned Laudato Si. I think it's the most wonderful document of religious leadership. I wrote a Jewish response to it. My heart warmed to it because it's full of a sense of love of creation. And I think whatever narrative we create, it has to be rooted in a sense of love and hope. Life matters, all life matters. We are dependent on other life. We care for one another together, and we do this for the sake of our children and for the future of the globe. And a note that is positive has to carry that narrative, because stern warnings, and this will overtake you like a flood, it's not going to be adequate to change people's hearts, because all of us freeze up at the thought of fear only. I think also the narrative has to be a can-do narrative. I think your example, Najma, at the end of what 2 women achieved in one country, that sense of courage and initiative and personal action is really important. That's why I think I've latched on, like many others, to it's not a complete solution, but to the importance of planting trees, because so long as they're the right trees in the right places, planted ethically and with ecological wisdom, but there's a sense there that this carries a can-do. I can get involved, and also, Irene, Professor Irene, in your talk, gardening, creating community spaces, the sense that this narrative will engage us and enrich us personally in our, we'll have the earth in our hands. I also think that the spiritual rootedness, that's one of the very, very simple sayings from Jewish mysticism, there is no space in which God is absent, which means in the plants, in the trees, in the birds, in all of us, is a very compelling sense of the spirituality within, not of a transcendent ruling God, but of a God, as it were, who's vulnerable to the damage we do and will grow with the planting that we do. So there's a piece there, and this involves art, it involves song, it involves storytelling, it involves the pulpit, involves leadership about the narrative we create. And so that's part of what I wanted to say. The second part is the action that has to follow from it. And I've never in my whole career, I'm 63 now, found myself interested in power in the way I'm interested in it now. Not because I want power, because I want to be able to influence power and feel very impotent in that regard. So talking about action, I think there is no choice but for it to begin with personal action. And a response I often get is, what's the point of me doing X if in these countries they're opening new coal-powered power stations? But I think there are several answers to that. First of all, the world is made up of billions of individuals, and we are the people who have some capacity to change their lives. The other is, if we don't take personal action, I think we've got no moral authority to ask anybody else to do anything. So it begins there in how we consume. how much we consume. And I think there's a profound challenge to a notion of entitlement, which is close to the heart of a lot of our societies. I have to say, I'm part of that. I'm part of and belong to a civilization that I regard as corrupted in this way, and struggle with it, not too successfully. But it begins with personal action. It moves to community action, and I think this was already mentioned, that communities have a lot of assets, that communities have the capacity to contact and motivate a large number of people. And pulpit, we've seen this in nefarious ways, but also in constructive ways. Pulpit is power, because one can reach a lot of people. And also our religions have got wisdom, a sense of the presence of God. If we communicate spirituality in a diverse and multifarious way, and not a sort of too theo and anthropocentric way, we also have within religious tradition the notion of discipline, that the things we do, but also things we say, that's wrong. And I think a language of wrong is also important. Thank you. And from there also to political engagement. And here I think it's extremely important to be interconnected, that we're not siloed as religious leaders, but that we're able to meet with economic leaders, political leaders, legal leaders, agriculturalists, and that there's some sense of holistic coming together with a discourse, both of values that's led into action, and that's national and international. So to sum up, there's the story, there's the action, and then there needs to be the collective influence on the direction of our countries and of the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for ending with this call to action, I suppose, and not just letting us sitting here in our comfortable chairs at home, wherever that might be. And I think it was really interesting also that you were mentioning the element of power, because Jonathan is also speaking here on lieu of Rabbi Jeffrey Newman, who, as some of you might know, last year was arrested as part of an Extinction Rebellion protest in kind of his full ritual gears. You want, like, confronting power, if you want, in the sense of saying the powers that be do not act in the way they necessarily need to. So kind of different, I think the question of what to do and how to relate oneself to power is something that I think goes through all the three talks, kind of more in the in the very confrontative sense, or kind of legal sense in Najma's talk, but also kind of the question of like more festivally kind of type that Irene was talking about. So now is the time to ask questions. I would like to invite everybody to type their questions into the Q&A box, and I will then read some of them out. While the questions are coming in, I would like to just give maybe Irene and Najma the opportunity to respond maybe to some of the other talks. So do you have any questions, maybe something like you would like to share?
I'll go perhaps first. I think first to unmute goes first. I think I really loved the points that you raised, Rabbi. I think for me that questioning, the ultimate purpose of our economies, and I come from a part of the world and have worked in countries where, as you said, you can take this complete dichotomy where countries still have to, address the basic needs of their citizens and have to grow and manage their resources in that way. But I do think that, when you do speak to people and when you have, conversations around what is a good life, what makes you happy, what is sufficiency, what is necessary for your well-being, I do think, that having those kind of conversations are so necessary. And I do think that a big part of the answer to this dilemma that we face here is questioning the sort of trajectory of our economies. And I think, that is that's an incredibly important part of this equation. As someone I sometimes tell myself I should just really, it's really hard to engage power and to influence and advocate for change. I sometimes, and I have as as someone in the sector, put myself sometimes in positions that you have to sit opposite, someone who fundamentally thinks, differently to you. But I do think that you've got to build those bridges. You've got to make the case for. And I mean, let me just answer very quickly. There was a question in the chat on nuclear energy. The court case in South Africa was not won on not on environmental grounds. It was entirely on a governance. It was entirely on how the procurement process was run. But the reality is that as a country, don't even go to the moral arguments about, whether nuclear energy is right or not, or the country cannot afford it. It's a country that's got an unemployment rate pre-COVID of almost close to 30% unemployment and a youth unemployment rate of over 50%. So it's a country that has to invest in its people. It has to create labor-intensive, job-creating industries, and that is not nuclear energy. It will not work for our country. We don't have the fiscal space, and the procurement was a corrupt process, and it was attacked on that basis and won on that basis. But there's a very strong, I feel, moral argument against, nuclear energy. That depending on, I guess, where you sit in the spectrum of how important it is to leave a better world for future generations. You'll be leaving behind a waste product that will take thousands, hundreds of thousands of years to actually break down and get to a level where it's not radioactive and unsafe, and finding places where we can do this. We've even heard people speaking about sending this out, to space. I think there is a moral argument, to be made on whether it's the right choice. And if you look at, if someone had asked me that question 10 years ago, before we know what we know now about the viability of renewable energy, I might have entertained it personally. But I think we know enough about renewable energy to know that nuclear energy is not, the best option for us, both from a financial and an environmental perspective.
Yeah, thank you very much, Najma, for sharing that. So questions are coming in. Please continue to do that. Irene, first I would like to get you the chance to respond, and then we'll take some of the questions.
Yeah, maybe something which could be interesting from my perspective. It's thanks a lot for both of you for your very interesting inputs and thoughts. And Switzerland is such a privileged country. I mean, this is so interesting also to see that we are not dealing here. It was an issue for us when we started the research. We wanted actually to go where, activists were fighting for their sort of survival, like this happens in other places of the world, like where the rising of water level is directly going to wash away villages. Things like this are not happening in Switzerland. So it's very important to have this ethical and moral standpoint where you look for the inequality that actually environmental degradation generates. And in Switzerland, you cannot see it immediately. You have to look into the statistics, for instance, to see how many people actually are dying or are ill from air pollution. You have to go to top the mountains, and people suddenly are seeing that the icebergs the ice is melting, and this is like the whole imagery of the Swiss mountains and of this huge wonderful landscapes where they like to go on Sundays is actually melting away, and this water is going somewhere else to make the worst, actually, the worst impact. It will probably be somewhere else. But we are starting to have plants that are usually only in tropical areas and things like this. But it's very important to have this long-term perspective and to see, okay, even if probably I will not be impacted immediately in my life course, what am I giving to my daughter, to my children? What are they going to give to their daughter and children? And I think there is where really this transcendence in a way comes into people's thought. Well, they have to think out of themselves and not just think where their boundaries are. And that's I think, this is why it's not interesting to see what in Switzerland is going on, because we actually finally we're dealing with very small things compared to other problems. But we do actually, Glencore, all these people are based here economically also. So this is extremely important to have this critical stance, and we have to make this distanciating and, to critical perspective, engage with it, because it's not immediate. It's not necessarily immediate in our everyday life.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think this perspective of what is imminent, what is transcendent, and something that struck me in your talk also about ecology becoming kind of spiritualized or kind of transcendent. And then the question would be like, was ecology ever really kind of not spiritual, or when was that? Which brings us to the question, when have we ever been kind of modern in the disenchanted way? And again, Amitav Ghosh says, like, actually, in many regards, we haven't. Yeah, this will be a further discussion. I want to take up some of the questions that are there. So the first one, I think, is the question by Daniel Button. Faith traditions, he writes, despite their positive view of creation and relationship to it, are often stymied by their eschatology. So the view of last things, often viewing the vertical, going to heaven or paradise, as the ultimate destination. How do you overcome this eschatological view, where a spiritual destiny seems to circumvent the need for a physical future to the earth? So kind of the question of determination, maybe, and eschatology. And the second question I want to kind of take with that as well is a question by Heather Thomas about the question of power and how we perceive power to transform society. And I think that there's actually two questions. Another one was about how do we bring society with us? And this is the question, how do we think kind of power over to in conversation, bring that with power with, like, new ways of dealing with power. Jonathan, do you maybe want to start on that?
So two quite different areas. I mean, the eschatology piece, and Judaism is a very, very this world rooted religion. There is a concept of heaven and reward for sure, but actually the focus is, it's often said it's a religion that tries to bring heaven down to earth and earth down to heaven, and there's a huge focus on our responsibility here on this earth, and particularly towards our children. Teach them to your children is a very central precept of Judaism. So that's not what I see as the obstacle to commitment to changing the way we live. The difficulties are that it somehow changing the human-centered into a whole creation-centered way of thinking about the presence of God is the most important. And then re-envisioning, as a very urban people now, Jews used, it's 20th century onwards, used not to be, reliving and recapturing our relationship with nature and seeing it as sacred. Those are two of the challenges. In terms of power, I remember I've got a senior civil servant in my community, and I just asked her, how do we influence? And her response was, in a democracy, what large numbers of, in quotes, reasonable, ordinary people are perceived to care about is what most politicians feel that win votes. One of the real challenges is democracies are often short-termist, because the focus is on getting re-elected in a very short space of time. And that can undermine long-term thinking, which has to be at the heart of ecological planning. So the question of power is, how can one convince political leaders who are making decisions, and there's a lot about agriculture and trade deals going through Parliament at the moment, that actually the way we treat our land, our livestock, and our energy sources is determinative. How can that be made important in the face of short-term economic interests? And one of the things that I wonder about is whether it'll be political leadership that is at the forefront, or actually economic leadership, when people begin to think what are really bad investments and what are better investments in green energy. So it's just some questions around that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Najma or Irene, do you want to jump into that? We have loads of questions, so you invited.
I'll give you some time to go through them, Tobias, and select what you want us to speak to. I mean, I think as a fellow Abrahamic tradition, it's absolutely the same on the question of whether this focus on this life is not the end, and we believe that there's another part to existence, is entirely determined on what we do right here and right now. So it's not a cop-out that, there's a better life awaiting. It's, I always love, in Islam, there's a tradition about the importance of accountability. And those of you who've eaten dates, you know that within the date, there's the pith, and there's a little fiber that you pull out of the pith, something that sits in between it, and it's as thin as a piece of thread. So there's a tradition that every person would be accountable for everything that's in their care, even the piece of thread that you pull out of the dates. And it just makes me think a lot when I eat dates that I'm going to make sure this goes in the organic part of the, it makes me think deeply about how important, you know, accountability is, and how that will determine how the next part of your life will be like. And I think that's generally my understanding when I do speak with Muslims and people of other traditions that also believe, you know, in an afterlife, in a life beyond this. It certainly doesn't, you know, preclude you from acting on the traditions. I think the other question that I'd love to respond to is the one about power and how to engage power. And again, you know, I'm beginning to, I hope I'm getting wisdom, but I'm beginning to get real inspirations from stories. And I was speaking with a colleague of mine from South Africa recently that's an activist on racial justice. And he was telling me that a colleague of his that works in the White House as part of the Black Caucus and as part of the sort of lobbying groups in the White House has said that the Black Lives Matter movement has achieved what they hadn't achieved in 10 years. Of lobbying and advocacy and following the channels and waiting for the meetings with senators and the powers. And I just think we shouldn't discount the power of agency, that people have agency, you know, and where we have democracies, please use it. You know, we don't have it all over the world, and we can see under COVID-19, as, you know, as horrific as it's been watching the health impacts, we are seeing that this is a time when some countries have just really come down hard, you know, on their citizens and close any space, you know, for dissent or for questioning. So embrace those, you know, agency moments. And as the Rabbi said, you know, you have structures within your societies. We have citizens' assemblies. I think that's going to become, you know, more common as a way to get ordinary people to express their aspirations and their wishes. And really it's something to celebrate, you know, that freedom of being able to participate in decision making. So please do use that agency.
Thank you. Irene, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, maybe a couple of points. It's very interesting, all these questions. I'm thinking of the example of the ecofeminists, for instance. That's a very interesting example because they are really, you have quoted Najma Vandana Shiva very shortly. And I think all these points of view and the words they use, like reclaiming and to give back force to reproductive work, for instance, to the autonomy, as you're saying about agency, all these things can be very strong, and they should not be, you know, underestimated in terms of power issues. But of course, they are not frontal. It's not about a frontal revolution against something, because there's too much diversity, which is a richness, but it's also a handicap in a way, an obstacle within the environmentalist movements. I mean, economy, for instance, has been long seen as antithetic to ecology, and probably it is in some way, thought in a capitalistic way, but more and more you have liberal environmentalists coming in, and actually they can make a lot of money with ecology. Suddenly, you know, these renewable energies are really getting actually very interesting, economically speaking. So probably the logic that has to be found is really to go into this idea of accumulation, of consumption, and finding new models of really just thinking, what do I need to live happily? And not necessarily to what else can I do, what maybe I didn't even think about yet. So, all these technologies, for instance, the environmentalist movement has now overcome a phobia against technology, but they are still very critical. And I think this is also something that religions and spiritualities can help in a way to kind of, okay, you can do a religious service or whatever at distance behind the screen, but that does not replace physicality and the body and the senses and these emotions and all these immediate experience of you and around you and the nature and the environment. And I think these notions of reclaiming, in a way, reclaiming also the power to some feminists, ecofeminists talk about, for instance, they don't want to essentialize, to say all women have to be the same, mothers or whatever, when they say Mother Earth, but use some metaphors in a strategic way to just make more sensitivity about how important it is to, you know, to value reproductive work, for instance, and not only productive work. Like all these kind of issues can be brought along to attack, in a way, or not necessarily to spend energy attacking the power to reproduce another power, but really to construct, to build a real alternatives. I mean, there are so many numerous people and, you know, villages now that are transition towns and all these kind of very interesting. You can find, if you want to find something in the ecological area, you can find today everything. From countries like Albania, who live totally on renewable energies, to people who self-organize totally, no waste, everything. But of course, it's very hard. Maybe what we should be very attentive is not to go too quickly into universalizing ethics, because they can be tricky and they can erase all this diversity and these cultural nuances. For instance, vegan movements, of course, they are more ecological than others. But of course, how can you say to many people to be totally vegan and keep their religious faith, for instance? So there's a lot of tricky issues there. Modesty, in a way, I think would be one of the key words.
Yeah, thank you. Which links us back to the ecofeminist approaches, and there's also different ways to think about that. Humility, like a lot of, I think, core elements of religious tradition kind of come back into environmentalist discourse here as well again. So we have more really interesting questions. Not that much time. I'll take 3 of them, and then probably we'll have to draw to a close. But they're really interesting. So Sally Myers from the Woolf Institute, who's also a minister, an Anglican minister, asks whether maybe actually there is something that we're seeing is a kind of, well, I paraphrase it, kind of convergence towards a common language of the sacred actually in relation to nature that is occurring across different movements. And that, she asked your opinions on that. Secondly, Lucia from Brazil just shared this feeling of powerlessness, and I think it's just very, like, there's also I think the question of hope there, and someone else mentioned the question of joy as well, like how narrate that in a joyful way. And finally, there's of course the question of COVID-19. Does that response, or kind of the window of opportunity has been often framed within environmentalist movement, make you hopeful, or is that something that you are rather distraught about? Jonathan, do you want to begin again the round?
Thank you. Yeah, the question of a common language, or perhaps diverse languages within our own traditions and communities that find all kinds of points of contact and overlap, so that we can relate to each other and try at least to understand each other's ideas of the sacred and of wonder without losing our own particularity at the same time. I think there's been lots said about the importance of space and our space, and beginning with our own locality and geography, but out of that, finding ourselves able to understand and appreciate and value the way others articulate similar things. So we have the richness of diversity together with the solidarity of convergence. That would be my ideal. In terms of powerlessness, hope and joy, just sort of taking a deep breath, because it's such an issue that a lot of people I know feel powerless and hopeless before what they sense is an overwhelming wave. And I think it was in your presentation right at the beginning, Najma, that you had a picture of these huge waves going to come across the whole of our world. And we may be powerless, but we cannot accept the notion that we need to empower ourselves against the notion of powerlessness, because powerlessness will lead us to passivity. And that's why small actions need to be really validated. Every small thing that we can do really counts. I heard a discussion among children who were being interviewed at a school about their view of the environment here in England. And one of them was asked, what difference does it make what you do? And this kid, they were about 8 years old, said, well, I feel I'm contributing something. And if I do that, I tell my friends, and so a sense of solidarity through making our contributions is what we have to argue for hope, for joy against powerlessness.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Najma, if you want to continue.
I don't know if I can express it better than what the Reverend just did. I mean, I think he mentioned so much of what I would want to say, you know, and I hope came across from the examples that I shared, you know, in coming together faith communities around ecological and social justice issues in South Africa. We all came with our authentic message and understanding and our particular resources and tools in the box that were different, but we were stood together, you know, on a common issue. And that solidarity really, when you're working on an action, it comes through, you know, very strongly. And we're seeing it, you know, in the environmental movement would have dreamed up an Extinction Rebellion or a Sunrise Movement or Fridays for Future a while back, but they're here now, and the environmental movement is not the same anymore. And you're seeing citizens come together and stand, you know, in solidarity. So I do think, you know, that this space is there. On joy, I mean, I really loved that question. And going back, I mean, Tobias, you explained the picture, and I'd hope that everyone had seen that the picture I grew up as a South African was a picture of an incredibly beautiful beach, but segregated by a barrier that separated, you know, whites and people of color and in South Africa. But I think growing up, there was both, you know, a joy for me in nature, a hope that things would change, and agency, taking up that agency. And probably I would not want to go back there. I don't know if I have the same courage and bravery as I did at 15, 16 years old to actually partake in and get thrown in the back of a police van, or I've got responsibilities and a family now. But it took that, but it also took the solidarity and the work of people in this part of the world that stopped, you know, trade relations with South Africa, that made really bold decisions, that pushed that government, you know, brought it to its knees and realized that, you know, they couldn't anymore. You know, on COVID, I mean, I think I've been working so much on this last few months, you know, is this really an opportunity? And if you think back about the, you know, the financial crisis that we've had, this is an opportunity for us. It's a wake-up call. And can we change course? You know, is there enough will to change this course? And I think, you know, that it is a moment that we have to really look at who has been affected by this pandemic. What has it shown us about the fragilities, the vulnerabilities in our societies and our communities? And how can we ensure that this, you know, doesn't happen, you know, again? But thank you so much, Tobias. Let me hand over to Irene. Sorry, I kept note of the time.
Yeah, well, it's hard to say anything interesting after these two very good last speakers. Maybe just one thing, we're talking about power and we feel so, you know, so about human power here. Look at, as we're talking about ecology and environment, look at they work. Look at how even a mushroom is able to deconstruct nuclear. Nature, in a way, can do things we have never dreamt of. They probably do. In a way, of course, we need to attack this human power that actually can learn a lot from the power of nature, in a way, I think, from this temporality and how actually this root, you know, the roots work, how they communicate. I think this power that nature can give, gives it to it, an imagery that can emerge from there, and imageries have a lot of power. So simply, it's a long-term perspective.
Thank you so much. That last element reminds me of a question reported from Anna, the anthropologist Anna Tsing, which asked young PhD students working on ecology, who are your non-human allies in the field? And I think this is also an important question, not only like thinking about Jonathan's book, but also, yeah, really coming down to the mycelia and kind of the way nature works, and see that as an ally, and ask how we ourselves can be an allyship to that as well. So there's many questions I'm afraid that we couldn't answer, but the good thing is we're gonna reconvene in exactly 7 days here with a fantastic lineup of speakers. I mentioned already before, last Sunday will be with us Tim Winter, Skinner Racha, Justine Huxley, actually from the St. Ethelburger Center that you've been mentioning before, Jonathan, and Emily Schackberg. So it is now the possibility that I have to thank the Faraday Institute for their support, particularly Zoe, Zara, Alice, and at the Woolf Institute, Emma and Tara. We will put the recording of this online, so you will find it online. And finally, let me join you in a virtual clap of hands and thanking our panelists for their wonderful contributions.